Hello, my name is Diego, and I'm starting development in a new supernatural mystery adventure game. The vibe I'm going for is a mix of horror elements, a lot of mystery, and even some humor here and there. So, some of my references are the game Oxenfree, the podcast Welcome to Night Vale, and the Lovecraft mythos. The story of the game itself is actually inspired by a Call of Cthulhu one-shot that I wrote and directed last year. Of course, I won't be using the Call of Cthulhu RPG mechanics or anything like that, but I chose to recycle the plot because it almost perfectly fits my goals for this project. You see, my main goal is to make a game that I can actually complete. So this game will have a shortish story that can be played to completion in a few hours. It will have just one main location and a handful of NPCs. There's a lot of room to grow in the future, of course, but this is what we are aiming for, at least for now. There's one area where I want to be a bit more ambitious, and that's in regards to player choice. I'm sick and tired of games that claim to allow player choice, but then every path is exactly the same. I want choices to actually matter. So, for this game I want to make it as branchy and as non-linear as I possibly can. With all that in mind, I created a new GameMaker project and started working on this new, as of yet unnamed game. You will be talking a lot in this game. You'll have to interview suspects, learn their secrets, and build relationships. As such, I decided that my first task should be to design an interesting dialogue system. Nowadays, most games with branching dialogue seem to follow some variation of the same system. It's usually a handful of dialogue options arranged in the form of a list, or a wheel if they are feeling fancy. Sometimes there's a time element to keep the pacing of the game going, and sometimes options can be locked behind a morality system. It's a good, tried and tested system, but there are some aspects about it that I don't really like for my project. Since we are making a very narrative-heavy, detective-like game, I want players to actually think about what they are saying and make their own deductions. And picking options from a list is not the most engaging activity for the brain. I want to reward players who pay attention to the plot, remember key details, and come up with interesting solutions. And a standard dialogue system can feel too hand-holdy for my taste. One alternative to this would be to copy those old text adventure games, where you have to type your answers instead of picking from a list. This definitely gives more freedom to the players, but it sort of goes too far in the other direction. More often than not, players could get stuck typing invalid answer after invalid answer until they could find the specific wording that the developers thought of before they could move on. So, after studying both options, I decided for my game I'd land somewhere in the middle. The player will have to manually type the dialogue, but it will work more like a search bar. You type a couple of words, and the game brings up the dialogue choices that more closely match your search. If you've played Her Story, which is a fantastic game by the way, it's kinda like that, but instead of searching for videos, you search for your dialogue choices. This system has a couple of advantages that I really like. One is that the player has to pick a valid option to move on. They can't send random inputs and they'll never get the "I don't know what you mean" response that was so common in text adventures. The other advantage is that every option is not on display from the get-go. If there's a clever out-of-the-box answer, the players will have to think for themselves and manually search for it before it becomes available. With that done, I added a synonym system, so there's many wordings for every possible answer. Players shouldn't get stuck because they wrote "I'm okay" instead of "I'm fine." I also added keywords to some answers. Basically, I don't want players to stumble upon some key dialogue choices. For example, if there's a dialogue option that reads, "I know about the secret basement," you'll have to type the word basement before the option unlocks. If you only write, "I know the secret," the game won't give away the answer. But that's only for the big secret options. For most other options, I actually want the complete opposite. So if a player is stuck and they can't come up with anything to say, they can type, "I think," or "what about," and the game will give them some suggestions to keep the plot going. I'm well aware that this is kind of a weird system, and it might end up being awful to play, but in concept I really like it, so I think it's worth it to give it a go. Of course, a system that involves typing doesn't really work with a controller, which is sad. In the future I might add like an optional controller mode that switches to a more traditional option list, but that's not really my priority at the moment. So that's how the choices will work, but how do we actually add all the dialogues to the game? A few years ago I participated in a game jam in which we made a sort of visual novel / dating sim game with a lot of dialogue choices. While the system itself worked fine, it was a pain to implement the dialogue. I had to keep track of every branch in my head and manually code every option, to the point that a simple conversation could take up to an hour to implement. That simply cannot be the case for this project, so I needed an easy way to write and iterate a lot of dialogue very quickly. Here's a useful tip: make tools. You can either work really hard throughout the entirety of the project, or you can work really hard at the very beginning and create a tool that will make the rest of the work really easy for you and your team. In this case, my team is just me, but I definitely want to make things easy for future me. That idiot cannot be trusted with the hard stuff. So, I coded a visual dialogue writing tool where I can add dialogue choices, conditions, switches, a randomizer, notes. Basically, I can make a dialogue tree as simple or as complex as I want. And then I go right click, export, and I have a handy GML script with the whole conversation that I can just copy and paste into the project. Then I spent some time polishing the tool and adding some quality of life features, like undo and redo with Ctrl+C, the ability to import character portraits, a search and replace option to make quick changes to the whole dialogue tree, and support for some text formatting, like bold, italics, color and font, which all sound like basic stuff, but GameMaker's built-in text functions are famously not great. Oh, and I added the ability to draw sprites directly into the text, for icons, emojis and the like. I actually spent the first couple of weeks only working on the tool and not the game. But believe me when I tell you that it will save me a lot of time in the long run. With the dialogue tool done, now I had to tackle the player-facing side of the dialogue system. So I drew a couple of character portraits for some NPCs. In the future I'd like to have variations of each character portrait to show different emotions, but just one drawing per NPC works fine for now. You might be wondering, why didn't I make a portrait for the main character? Well, that's because I want the player character to be customizable in a character creator, and that's a whole beast in and of itself. Then I made some very basic UI that will probably be improved in the future, some animations, and I threw it all together as a GameMaker sequence. And there we have it, a dialogue system and a tool to implement lots of dialogue really fast. Of course, that's only the bare bones of one system within a project that's not even close to being a game yet. But it's a start. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like if you did. I've never done a devlog like this, so I'm hoping to get better as I go along. I'll gladly take any kind of feedback in the comments, and I'll be happy to discuss the game with anyone who wants to. Just leave a comment below. It can be in English, Spanish, anything you like, as long as what you like is English or Spanish. Next time we'll probably get into the animations and character creation system, so I hope to see you guys there. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Goodbye!